Welcome to the 1920s presentation. We're looking at the Roaring Twenties. We already talked about the first, I'd say 20 slides, 30 slides. Just a quick recap. We're looking at 1920s. We idolize it. It's an era. It's a decade. It's lived on. It's timeless. Still talked about to the present day. Parts of the 20s did roar. They were loud. All this new technology, all this money, capitalism. It's, as Kenzie mentioned, it's a business-oriented decade. Things are focused around businesses. We're going to see pendulums shift and swing, I should say, back. And we're going to see the unions not be something that's very prevalent or very powerful in the 1920s, more business ownership oriented. And we also know it's called the Jazz Age. It's that name from F. Scott Fitzgerald. We have idolized the decade. We've focused our selective attention just on the glamour and the glitz of the Roaring Twenties. And we need to remind ourselves a living history is much different than a written history. And although radios did roar, microphones, new technologies, cities were loud, cars honked and sped up society, and probably impacted society more so than anything else in the early 20th century, you can make the argument for sure. There are a lot of things that weren't all glitz and glamour. The farmers, be a horrible decade, as Kenzie mentioned as well, for the farmers in 1920s. So again, remind ourselves, don't be swept up in the myths of the 1920s. There's more to it than just the flappers, the crime, the KKK. But this is where the attention will be primarily. We're looking at the decade. We remind ourselves, most historians claim that the progressive era kind of ended, ushering in the 1920s. And most of the progressive leaders are dead by then, or on their deathbed, and that includes Teddy Roosevelt. And I thought it was funny, one guy mentioned that he did end up dying in his sleep, and somebody made a quip that they had to take Teddy in his sleep because if he was awake, there would have been a fight. That's kind of the Teddy Roosevelt, the guy, the legend. We do see this 1920s, this more people living in cities in America than rural areas. We see this conflict almost in the 1920s between rural areas, small towns versus the big cities, and we see this challenge to the traditions of the American past with this new modernity, new things that are taking root and changing American culture. And this big consumerism, this mass culture, which will be unified thanks to the radio, thanks to Hollywood. We'll see that as well. As we know, again, remind ourselves that we as students of history, fans of history, like to study the serpent is the focus in the Garden of Eden. This is where we're going to focus our attention oftentimes with the 1920s. We'll be on those things that maybe are a little more scandalous. We did talk about 1919, 1968, very tumultuous times. And looking at American history, we see this youth. We have a lot of young people in the 1920s. We're going to see them challenging the old traditions of the past. See the same thing in the 1960s. And some of the things that are going on going in the 1920s, there's this generation gap, same as the 60s, between the young and the old, and the young challenging authority. We do see racism, common thread in American history. We do see race riots breaking out in Chicago and Tulsa, and we just got back from Tulsa, and it has a monument to the worst race riot in American history. It took place in 1921, and it involved a white woman accusing a black kid of doing something on an elevator, I think touching her, groping her, and we see a riot break out. We see another one in Chicago, and African Americans, blacks, end up swimming in a segregated Lake Michigan, and it's corridored off, and black boy gets into white waters and ends up getting hit by a rock. He goes under, he drowns. Couldn't find the body, even though whites and blacks are both looking for the boy. Rumors get out that whites are attacking blacks, and we see riots break out, and many hurt. So we see this very As I mentioned, tumultuous time in American history. We see African Americans returning from the war, not going to put it up with it anymore. Many of the great migration is going to northern cities is going to attract racism and prejudice. Are going to bring those out, discrimination, and this kind of represents this era. We do see women gain power in the 1920s, getting women's suffrage and franchise, getting the right to vote. Women arguing that now's the time for equality, pushing for equality. We're going to see also, and again, I'm comparing this to the 1960s of the NOW movement, the National Organization of Women, where women are pushing for equal pay for equal work. We do see, as I mentioned, we see technological feats by man, with Charles Lindbergh flying across the Atlantic in 1927, and the fanfare he gets, and also we see 1960s, the decade closed, 1969, with Americans getting to the moon for the first time. We see sports stars really take off, where the heroes in America now are the sports legends of the past. We got pictures here of Jack Dempsey, we got Red Grange, we got obviously the Babe Ruth of the era. This is the sources we'll be using for this lecture, for this unit. These four are primarily the sources I'll be leaning off of, along with some podcasts as well. And we need to remind ourselves context, and you guys hit on these things here, the context of the 1920s. We got to look at World War I. We can't just bypass the greatest war up to that point in history, not playing a large impact on society in the day. These returning World War I veterans, when they come back home, these people will be coined by a lady by the name of Gertrude, I believe, Stein, I think her name was. She's going to be the one who calls Hemingway, you guys are part of a lost generation. This really focuses on the writers and the painters and artists of the day. They are lost souls. They travel from bed to bar and bar to bed, and they are drunk, and they're very cynical. They have a negative view. They challenge authority. And this generation, these people who saw the war up close, they do have a more cynical view, and they blame the authority for putting them there in those trenches in this senseless tragedy called World War I, or the Great War, I should say, at the time. So we have this iconic kind of group of writers and painters, artists who are labeled this because they do seem lost. They have kind of a deeper meaning of life, very abstract, and this is the story of the day. Now, again, we need context. World War I, a lot of men go off to fight, which is going to fill jobs. In fact, jobs are going to be needed to fill in the factories. These are located in the north, primarily in the cities. So we see women fill these jobs, and we also see African Americans get this opportunity. So many of them, in the hundreds of thousands, are going to leave the South, even over maybe 1 million. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. They're going to leave the South, and they're going to be traveling up north, known as the Great Migration, to fill these jobs. And we also see 1920s, we see technology improve in the homes, which will lead to women no longer needing to be at home so much. So this is going to make an impact. This is reinforcing this little illustration of the Great Migration, and you can see where they're heading, to the Midwest and to cities in the north, up there in the east. So we're going to see a byproduct of this Great Migration, these African Americans bringing their cultures and culture and customs, and they're going to bring these up north, and this will be known as the Black Mecca. It's kind of like almost a Zionist movement of Jews returning to homeland in Israel. African Americans, the belief was that Harlem is the place for the black man, and Harlem was built up for the white man, but white people never actually settle there. And we'll see this influx of African Americans, and this will be a place where many people travel to, black and white, especially at night, especially on weekends. You'll see whites fill the streets in Harlem. They want to go out. And we'll talk about fraud a little bit and make the argument that, at this time that you shouldn't be holding back your inhibitions. You should be lowering those, and you should be doing what you want to do. And again, you could argue this is a byproduct of World War I as well, but release that maybe sexual tension. You should be able to do that, and that's the argument in the 1920s. And it'll fill places. A lot of white people will flood the streets. again, especially on weekends, especially at night, and they'll go to expensive clubs like the Cotton Club, which is actually segregated at the time. African Americans could not even go there. So this is just reinforcing, in Harlem again in the North, is reinforcing the conditions between black and white, but also it's showcasing what African Americans can bring society. Pretty powerful. We also made the argument World War I plays a role on the fact of prohibition. Beer was associated with German, a lot of German establishments, a lot of beer, I should say, manufacturers with German roots, and this will lead to a push for prohibition. It'd be patriotic to push this through. The next thing is we needed grains for the food for the soldiers on the front line. So again, it reinforces that we need to end the manufacture and sale of alcohol. So we see this temperance movement really push through, led by in the forefront of women. And we see in patriarchal society, these women think they're doing best by the working class, the poor, doing best by these people from spending money and time in bars and saloons compared to spending home with their families. So this is it's a class thing, where the middle and upper class are judging the lower classes, the working class. They don't need to spend money on alcohol, but on their family to help them get out of their poor situations. And this will be kind of the push by many women. Next thing is owners like the idea of no alcohol as well, because then their workers wouldn't be coming in drunk. Many workers would stop on the way to work and drink some beer. So owners like the idea of prohibition as well. So we see this start out west, this whole movement of prohibition or temperance, and it's going to spread east. Eventually it's going to pass, known as the 18th Amendment, which is going to prohibit alcohol. And you're going to see that this is going to lead to a domino effect. And we'll talk about that, what Andy talked about with the organized crime, the speakeasies, and we'll see the prohibition lead to this kind of forbidden fruit in American history, creating this forbidden fruit. This will also lead to corruption and money shifting in the hands of gangsters, organized mobsters, organized crime. And these people will put fixes and they'll control a lot of things, like Arnold Rothstein, who will be the person who's most infamous for fixing the 1919 World Series between the Black Sox, Chicago White Sox actually, but known as the Black Sox. And that scandal gets released. There would have been no 18th Amendment, because we look at the 18th Amendment is going to keep the American government from actually taking money off taxes if there hadn't passed the 16th Amendment, which will be taxing the richer populations. The majority of people still didn't pay taxes with the 16th Amendment passing, but the richer Americans do, and eventually that'll span out into everybody paying. Context of World War I as well, it will lead to all kinds of problems in Russia, who suffers the most dead and casualties during World War I. And they're going to have a revolution where they overthrow the Tsar, Nicholas II, and they're going to install a communist revolution or communist government. Before they actually officially install it, there'll be a civil war that breaks out, Russian Civil War, where America will actually Woodrow Wilson will actually send over around 5,000 American soldiers to help out the whites against the Reds. This will plant the seeds for this distrust where America got involved in Russia, trying to stop the revolution, trying to put an end to the communism surfacing within that country. So we will see that Americans will be, they'll actually come over, they'll be unsuccessful, obviously. They'll return. I think 150 end up dying over there in Russia around the early 1920s. So with Russia falling to communism, this is going to put a scare into Americans. We can see this with a lot of immigrants coming over, and especially from that revolution as well, but a lot of immigrants traveling to America are from Eastern Europe, and there's this label at the time, the Slavic people are not as civilized as the Western Europeans. So we see this is going to create some type of red scare. And we think also with these Eastern Europeans, where communism just took root, that many of them are anarchists and they want to overthrow the American government. So this creates the first of two red scares. The second red scare will be in the 1950s, which will lead to the Palmer raids. And you'll see Palmer will, on the left over here, he's going to hire a former librarian, J. Edgar Hoover, on the right, and they're going to start to put files on thousands of Americans, of these labeled anarchists, these immigrants coming over, these Eastern Europeans, and they're going to start to do a lot of shady things, violating the Constitution, of getting information on people. Now, J. Edgar Hoover, he's going to be the guy who takes this job and runs with it, and he will be a power hog, and he'll be somebody who cares really very little about individual rights, and he'll be responsible for spying on all kinds of Americans. He is a very polarized figure in American history. Some people love him, some people hate him, but he represents somebody who abuses their powers. He'll be responsible for spying on MLK Jr. in the 1950s and 60s, Malcolm X's of the world, and other presidents. Presidents fear this guy because he has dirt on everybody, seemingly. So we'll see the Palmer raids and a lot of arrests, a lot of deportations, and Americans kind of get swept up in this fear because of this communist spread. However, due to how extreme Palmer goes with these raids, many Americans kind of will change their stance on this. They'll lose interest, and they want to protect their freedom. So by the early 1920s, we see that first Red Scare really fan out. Even though on Wall Street, I believe it was 1921, check real quick, you will see, 1920, I'm sorry, you will see a explosion rock Wall Street. And you see many people killed in this explosion. When a truck rolls up, it's packed with explosives, it's going to explode moments later. And even though you have all these deaths, this horrific explosion, many Americans are bored with it. They want to move on, just reinforcing the fact that Americans have very little care about this Red Scare. As I mentioned, Union will lose power in the 1920s. And we can look at this guy in the top left. This is as mayor of Boston, Calvin Coolidge, when Boston police officers, they strike to get better work conditions and higher wages. And this will lead to Calvin Coolidge actually firing all of them. He says, police have no right, public safety, to go on strike. We'll see Ronald Reagan do the same thing in the 1980s with the air traffic control. They try to do the same thing, and he tells them, you better get back to work. I will fire all of you. They do not. They stay on strike, and all of them will be fired. And we see Calvin Coolidge. He does the same thing here in Boston. Going in 1920s as well, we remind ourselves we had the worst epidemic in the history of the world. And we see hundreds of thousands of Americans killed with the Spanish influenza that spreads. Starts in Kansas at an army base, and it's going to spread throughout the world, especially American soldiers traveling across the Atlantic Ocean. So we see this is all the things that are leading into the 1920s. As well as 1915, we'll see the release of a movie called The Birth of a Nation. And Woodrow Wilson will actually show this in the White House. He'll play this premiere in his White House. And he was a very well-known racist as president, as he segregates the government whenever he steps in office. So even though labeled a progressive, just reinforces the fact that progressives were not known for their social pushes for equality for minorities. Even though they were pushing for equality in the workplace in regards to better work conditions, living conditions. But The Birth of a Nation is going to be really going to popularize the Klan, that it's doing its part to attack back the African Americans who are, as it claims, attacking white women. It's the protectorate of the white race and white women from African Americans who are savages. Again, that's the film's kind of the message of the film. We see historiography here as well, because historiography is that how the dust never settles in history, how we are always constantly judging former leaders of the past based off of our present morals, our current morals and our current standards. At Princeton University, where Woodrow Wilson was the president, we see a push for eradicating his monuments and tearing down his name from any kind of building in Princeton because of this racism. So this is something, his name has been tarnished because of his choices, because of his beliefs of the past in a different era. Now the KKK is going to grow exponentially due to the birth of the nation, due to this sale of fraternity and networking, and how Dinah mentioned how they target the top ranking people in communities in regards to target. They're trying to get them to get involved in the Klan. They're promoting all the positives of the Klan. even to do some horrific things as well. So we'll see the Klan grow into the millions in the early 1920s. That will come crashing down though when we see D.C. Stevenson over here in the top left, who is the head of the Klan in Indiana. He will be charged with raping and essentially murdering a white female teacher in Indiana. And she will, after the fact she was raped, she will, in a lot of pain, she asks for medication, and she actually ODs on it. And then she could have been taken to the hospital, but he leaves her there, and she ends up dying. And then when they find her, her body's ravaged. And he thinks he's going to get off because he's connected. He's helped get a lot of the political leaders, people in charge in Indiana, to power. And when they tell him they're going through with it, he's going to whistle blow on the Klan activity in Indiana, which is going to represent the Klan in a more negative light. And people realize that this is not the protectorate or the savior of white women. Instead, you can make the argument it's quite the opposite. So we see this Klan in America. It blows up in the early 1920s. It's going to die down by the mid 1920s. But we do see the Klan and all these immigrants coming in is going to lead to the nativists pushing through the immigration ban of 1924. Very famous, very well known. And it's going to push this in, and it sets a quota on immigrants coming in from certain countries. And Japanese will be banned completely, the Asians. And this will actually lead to Japanese in Japan, in Tokyo, and other cities. They're going to start burning the American flag. And we see the writing on the wall. There's a lot of hatred maybe going both ways between the Japanese and America. And this won't help, this immigration ban, 1924. And that will also lead to, as I mentioned multiple times, Anne Frank's family not being able to get out and get to America, leading to her death. So we see this 1924 will lead to that down the road, cause and effect. Now, Americans are really wanting a return to normalcy. And this is the campaign slogan of Warren Harding. World War I has proven to be it wasn't a good thing for America. So, and they're kind of sick of Woodrow Wilson and how intelligent he wants everybody to think he is and try to prove. They want somebody simpler and a guy who looks the part. He's handsome. He's the catch in Marion, Ohio, and owns a newspaper company, and his name is Warren Harding. I find it somewhat comical. The fact that Warren Harding, he looks so young, he looks so healthy. Woodrow Wilson at this time, he looks like he's on his deathbed. He's suffered major stroke after stroke, and Woodrow Wilson will actually outlive and be at Warren Harding's funeral when this is all said and done. Warren Harding is somebody who had an insatiable desire for chasing women. He will be somebody who runs around on his wife multiple times, and philanderer, and he will be somebody who is kind of regarded as not president material. And he actually, if you look at Warren Harding, there's actually his reputation has been salvaged somewhat. He actually will be the first president to actually travel down to the South and tell them that segregation and the lynchings are unacceptable. He'll tell people in Birmingham, actually, Alabama, which is a hotbed of a lot of the racism in the South. So this is Warren Harding, but his legacy is tarnished because with Warren Harding, he's synonymous with corruption, and he was actually never involved directly with any of the scandals that broke out. But his friends, who he brought into office, it was called the Ohio Gang, who were in the White House, they will be very much so taking kickbacks and busted red-handed with stealing money from veteran associations. There's a teapot scandal in Wyoming where not supposed to drill into certain conservation lands, and that will be something that happens under his watch. And again, he just he's surrounded by friends. He says, I don't have a problem with my enemies, it's my damn friends. And that's Warren Harding. It's kind of his legacy. I think his reputation has, like I said, been salvaged somewhat because he does do a few things. His wife is very she's really hands-on in the White House. He brings in black leaders, talks to them. She reads to black boys and white children and black children. So he does have definitely some positive characteristics, but he will actually end up dying in office. Now, he did, as I mentioned, the affairs. One of those was this young lady, Miss Britton, Nan Britton. She actually will end up impregnating Warren Harding's daughter, and this is a book she wrote. She disclosed, and it's the president's daughter, and kind of a tell-all tale of Warren Harding, and that was 1927. There was another woman who he got caught having an affair with as well, and she will, as he's campaigning actually for office, and she's given a certain amount of money a month, and she's sent on a long ship sail or ship trip out to Japan and back during his campaign to kind of keep her silent, keep her out of the press. As I mentioned, his friends get involved in all kinds of scandalous activity. There's one, he was actually at a party or on a after party where prostitutes were brought in, and one actually gets killed by another prostitute, gets killed right in front of him. He gets kind of ushered out of there in a hurry under the cover of darkness. And we see again, he kind of gets his name dragged in the mud because of all these scandals that happen under him. He's going to be traveling out west when he gets about a food poisoning, they think. Next thing you know, he already had an enlarged heart. He was a heavy drinker. He was a heavy smoker. And Harding ends up having what most people think is a massive heart attack. He dies in San Francisco. And Calvin Coolidge, who's his vice president, will take the oath of office. Actually, interesting enough, read to him, took the oath with his father. Father read him the oath, I believe in her living room. So I thought that was interesting. Right there it says, Coolidge Sr. administers oath to his son in the same house where new chief was born. So it must have been his dad's house. So that was an interesting thing. Now, Calvin Coolidge, he is somebody who thinks the American business is business. That's the business of America is business. It's his motto. He's very pro-business oriented. His presidency, he is somebody who is tale of two sides. He was a man of few words. There was a reporter who came in and told Calvin, President Coolidge, I was told that I couldn't make you say more than 2 words, today. And he says, you lose. And I thought that was funny. And he also told two sides. He was actually very energetic. He was somebody who was deemed a very good president his first term, but his second term not so much. And the reason being is because he had 2 sons when he took the White House, and his one son was playing tennis without socks on, said shoes on, caught a blister. In that blister, he got infection, and he slowly withered away, and he ended up dying. And it was something that Coolidge was heartbroken about, and something he never kind of forgave himself for taking the White House. And it happened during his second term, very sad story. And his father died shortly, I think, thereafter. So during the second term, going into the second term, he's going to be very depressed. Suffered melancholy, and he was definitely not as effective as a president. He is ready to leave whenever the time is up. And we'll see him leave and be replaced by another pro-business guy named Herbert Hoover. Now, on the meantime, 1920s, it's known for flight, and you will see the airways and the travels. You'll see the mail be shipped over to flight, and it's a very dangerous job. In the first 6 years of the 40 pilots of the U.S. Post Office who are delivering mail, only 10 are still alive 6 years later, so it's a very dangerous thing. But we will see a lot of people do the barn tours, barn storming tours, where you see all kinds of people doing all kinds of crazy stunts. Be like America's Got Talent with airplanes, doing all kinds of crazy stunts on the airplane. One of those people was Charles Lindbergh, and they'll fly upside down, they'll stand up, they'll get out of the plane mid-flight, do all kinds of acrobatic stuff in the plane or on top of the plane. So this is the era, and we see Charles Lindbergh will be the first man to ever fly across the Atlantic, solo flight. And there was a $25,000 reward at the time for anybody who would fly from New York to Paris. And most people didn't think it could be done, but he will actually prove them wrong. His nickname was Lucky Lindy, and when he flies across, there are over 100,000 French people waiting for him in Paris for his arrival. He was an overnight, really the first overnight modern sensation, and it shows you the power of technology with the radio. And Calvin Coolidge will send a cruiser to go pick him up, and not one American taxpayer will complain that a ship is going to pick up Lindbergh. He'll bring him back, and he'll go under a ticker tape parade like the world has never seen. And ticker tape was actually something that was invented by Thomas Edison. Who else? And this ticker tape parade will cost New York City $71,000. 1,800 tons of confetti falls down, and it reinforces a common man in America can do uncommon things. He becomes the dude in the 1920s. And tragically enough, something happens in the 1930s to him with his baby, gets kidnapped and murdered right outside his house in a botched ransom, which sad story. Lindbergh also will be somebody who kind of loses some steam. He was somebody who was non-interventionist. He was isolationist. He was more pro-Nazi leaning. Actually, Adolf Hitler awards him with a German, I think, Iron Cross or Metal Cross or Iron Eagle award in the late 1930s. So his name kind of gets tarnished later on, but he is somebody who is beloved. He is at his height in 1927 of his fame. And just a quick story, Bert Hinkler was the second man to travel across the Atlantic Ocean, but nobody remembers Bert. They remember Charles Lindbergh, and they remember Amelia Earhart on the right here, because she was the first female to have a solo flight or fly across the Atlantic Ocean. So we see the power of the niche. Find your niche in life. There's a little life lesson. I found that story. I thought it was really cool. So that is where we're at right now. Other new inventions of the 1920s will be the telephone. And there's a book called How We Got to Now. There's also, it's on Netflix, awesome little historical documentary and book by Stephen Johnson. But he argues the hummingbird effect. We have all these different inventions that pop up in the 1920s, from the radio to the telephone to elevators to skyscrapers going up in the air, and all those play a role on one another, which is a whole other topic for another day. The biggest thing that really took off in the 1920s will be the automobile. It is the backbone of economic growth in the 1920s. It allowed people to travel, so you have tourism improve. People to live away from cities in the suburbs, so we have a growth in the housing construction, housing industry, and people were traveling around spending more money. And it also leads to, that hummingbird effect leads to the industries of oil and steel and rubber and road construction really taking off as well. It reduces the rural isolation of America. So if you really wanted to have one, thing that really changes the 1920s everyday life, it would be the automobile. It leads to a freedom of movement. I thought interesting enough that the first windshields would actually be popped down, so people with illusion of traveling faster than what they were. I'll get letting that air hit. And the reason why it blows up is because Henry Ford will master the mass production with the assembly line. Assembly lines were already in other fields, but not on the auto industry and not on the scale Henry Ford brings it to. And he could actually get a car, make a car. You can get a car as little as $300 in the 1920s. So it is something that is going to change the 1920s in the life. He produced a car every 93 minutes, and it is the engine of escape, is what it's kind of promoted as. So you can go take a girl out with you on a date, go on vacation, go to sporting events, and again, live further from cities. So we also need to make sure, remind ourselves, homes had to be reconstructed and reconfigured in the sense of you had to build houses closer to the curb. You had to add driveways and garages. So just all like the little things we don't think about. Traffic lights will be designed by 1920 Detroit policemen. So the automobile will lead to the creation of 1.5 million jobs in construction of highways. So I guess the big thing is automobile was to the 1920s what television was in the 1950s and what internet was in the 1990s. It is the ultimate status symbol. Ford himself, if we're looking at him, he's going to be somebody who actually only made his Model Ts, and is actually called the Model T because it was the 20th design of his automobile. But he's going to make all vehicles black. And an average vehicle costs $350. He's going to pay his workers $5 a day, which was insane amount of money. He'll hire women, he'll hire blacks, he'll hire Jews, he'll hire convicts, or former convicts. So he doesn't really care who he hires, and he pays them well because A, they can afford his product, and B, because it'd be easy to replace him because people want to get paid $5 a day. So he pays them well so they could do those two things. And he's going to be somebody who is a very controversial figure. As I mentioned, Hitler gave Lindbergh an award, a medal. You're going to see that he actually has, many people claim that whenever Hitler was in Munich in the 1920s, he had a picture of Henry Ford hanging up in his office because Henry Ford will he'll own a newspaper company in Dearborn, Detroit, called a Dearborn Independent, and it'll be very anti-Semitic. And many of the things in Mein Kampf will actually pull things from Henry Ford. So we do see this, the Model T. Now, we do see by the late 1920s, we see GM create a sleeker, more stylish version. They offer more colors, and we're going to see people actually flood to GM. GM will actually exceed Ford later in the decade. So this is the automobile. The 1920s, Henry Ford is known as Fordism. It's this economic system based on mass production and mass consumption. And he wanted to bring the automobile within reach of every American. And this is the 1920s, the power of the automobile and the power it has on America. And as I mentioned, GM wants sleeker models. We also see that they're going to really push towards, now Chrysler will push towards promoting for women to drive. And they create the Plymouth, think of the Plymouth Colony. It is pioneering. It is something that's bold. And they have Amelia Earhart, actually. She'll be the one who helps showcase and to show off the new Chrysler car. So we see this competition start breaking out in the 1920s. And we see people want different colors. They want special cars, Cadillac as well, which will be Al Capone will help sell that because he drove around a Cadillac with thick armor. But we do see people pushing in this consumer culture. How do we get people to buy not just one car, but two? How do they need to convince them they need another one? But we do see by the late 1920s the decline of purchases on automobiles and other industries. 1920s into part two will be consumerism.